trust. Whether you're in global energy or finance or manufacturing, you have to trust that the system is going to be there the next day. Otherwise, deliveries won't happen, power won't come on, manufacturing supply chains fall apart. Well, this isn't how the world has normally worked historically. In the world before World War II, we were imperial, and everybody had their own navy to basically shoot at other people and make sure that they got what they needed themselves. With World War II, that system came to an unceremonious end, and it left the Americans as the last men standing trying to figure out what's next. And when we looked east from Western Germany, we didn't like what we saw. The Stalinist Soviet war machine was terrifying. And we knew there was no way that the United States could stand up to the Soviets in Europe without a lot of help. So the trick was, how do you convince the Europeans, who have an epic poem of mutual grievances, to stand shoulder to shoulder in front of you and face down the Soviets with you? And so we bribed them. We basically created this global order where the U.S. Navy would make global commerce safe for everyone, even if you didn't have a single naval vessel. And you could go out and buy any commodity, bring it home, metabolize it into a finished good, and then export it for hard currency, probably to the American market. We basically paid to make this alliance that we now consider the global order. Well, we lost need for that back in 1992 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But we kind of took a vacation from international security, and for 4 presidents in a row really didn't update the system. So the U.S. kept paying for the system for everyone else, but not really gaining any benefit, because the whole idea was we pay you to be on our side. There was no economic upside to the United States for this. And now, 30 years on, Americans have completely lost interest. So the book is about how we got to where we are in the very first chapter, and after that it's about how it all falls apart and who starts to pick up pieces of the international system when there is no international system. So it's about the countries that we think of as the countries of the future and showing why they're really going to collapse, and how these countries that we think of as second and even third-rate places actually are going to rise to dominate the human condition. Well, I hate to tell them this, especially if he's at Microsoft, but that's really not going to happen. It's not that the digital system and digitization is not becoming more and more important. It's not that it's not insinuating itself into every part of every economic sector. That's definitely happening. But a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, digital infrastructure is still infrastructure. It still requires physical interconnections among countries. And pretty much all of the world's data goes through a series of subsea cables. Now, when the Twitter revolution happened in Egypt, the Egyptian military simply cut the 2 cables that took data in and out of the country and were easily able to crush and take over. The Russians then sent a team down to Egypt to say, hey, that was really cool. How did you do that? So the Egyptians showed them how, and the Russians now have kill switches on the 4 cables that come in and out of their country. The Chinese have built the digital firewall and have put similar killed cables on all of their cables. And if we ever get to the point where there's like a real conflict, you can guarantee that even the United States will cut all these cables on day 1 or 2. So we're moving away from a global digital infrastructure and into a more national system. There will be kind of regional blocks. I think the Western Hemisphere writ large will be more or less in one piece. But without the European Union, the European system is probably going to crack apart. And then, of course, all the other major powers are going to have their own. It doesn't mean there's not a place for digital, but you have to keep it in perspective. The second thing to keep about digital in specific and tech in general is it's not cheap. It's one of the most expensive things that we've learned how to do, especially when it comes to development and application. Well, we're deep. We're well past the point of no return in a global demographic inversion. And most of the developed world will be moving into mass retirement this decade, and the Chinese are already on average older than Americans. When you're in your 40s or your 50s and your early 60s, you generate a lot of capital. And we've had this huge bulge globally in that age demographic for the last 15 years. That is in part what has allowed the technological revolution, the digital revolution, to happen. That ends this decade. And if we're dealing in a world that is more fractured and doesn't have even a fraction of the capital that we have right now, I'm sorry, but the pace of this is going to slow down considerably. But the country where it will slow the most slowly, where we'll have the most time to adapt, is the United States. Because here, our baby boomer generation actually had kids. So say what you will about the millennials. You may think that they're lazy, they don't get up till 2 p.m. or what have you. They exist. And as they grow up, and I define that in the loosest possible terms, they are following the patterns of the generations who have come before. They are saving as they get older. That is the capital that drives technology. At least here we have the millennials. They don't exist in places like Canada or Germany or Japan or Korea or Thailand or Italy. There are a lot of ways to answer that question, so let me just kind of break it into three general pieces. First of all, there's something to be said for the general breakdown in international cooperation and early warning systems that have happened in the United States and around the world where we could have done better. That's fair. But keep in mind that the Chinese sat on all their data. They're still not sharing all of their data. So the first country outside of China that really had an experience was Korea, and that was basically at a megachurch. It's a cluster study, yes, but not an epidemic. The second one was in Iran, a country that no one has great relationships with and maybe isn't the best at data collection. The third country is Italy. It overwhelmed their system, and so all their testing happens at the hospital level. And all these three cases, that was all in less than a month. And then the next set is Spain, France, Germany, and the United States. So from the point that we got coronavirus, the word coronavirus, on the front page of any major newspaper, it's only been 2 months. That gives you an idea of just how communicable this thing is. And that's the key thing. It's communicable. Because of the speed of that, it was very difficult to have any sort of meaningful response. Second, we haven't had a meaningful response in part because the Trump administration has decided from day one that it doesn't like government. So there are still thousands of positions that are unfilled throughout the federal bureaucracy, including positions that would deal with issues like this, or deal with foreign cooperation on issues like this. There just aren't senior staff there to make calls, and that has absolutely hampered everything that we've been doing. And then the third issue is where we're going. Because this is 3 times as communicable as the flu, because about 1/5 of the people who contract the illness have to be in hospital for at least a little bit, we're talking about something that is going to take the wind out of the sails of the global economy, not for weeks, not for months, but probably until we get a vaccine. That will probably be in the summer or fall of next year. I don't want to leave you all depressed. There is a lot of new breakthroughs that we've had in genetics in the last few years. They're being applied to one strain of this vaccine effort, which is already 2-3 months ahead of schedule. So it is theoretically possible we'll have a working vaccine by this fall. Probably not for everybody, maybe for healthcare workers, but that would still break the back of this. But that means everything's offline. The only way that you can prevent mass infections is to go into lockdown. For the industrialized world, that brings a lot of things to the halt. To the developed world where social distancing is not possible, you're talking mass deaths, mass dislocations, and completely excising them from the global economy. Now, my position is because of demographics and geopolitics, this was going to be the last decade of the global order. It was all going to break down. We were going to go back to a more regional system with individual countries kind of having their own little spheres of influence. Coronavirus has sped that up because if this only lasts a year, by the time that this is over, we're going to be so close to the gross twilight of the baby boomer generation that there won't be time to rebuild afterwards before they vanish from the workforce and vanish as capital providers. You could argue that some parts of Europe are there already. And if you take the developing world offline and break all the supply chain systems, then everybody has to rebuild their manufacturing systems locally out of necessity. We're not going to go back to the old system. So coronavirus has probably taken 5 years off the clock of how long it would take the global system to break down. 2020, this may well be the year.